Laidą remia įkrautas elektromobilių įkrovimo sprendimai, saulės elektrinės ir energijos kaupikliai jūsų namams ar verslui.
Sveiki visi, čia karo kambarys, šį kartą aš be Algio, bet su svečiu pas mus studijoje šį kartą ypatingas svečias. Galbūt jisai pats labiau geriau save pristatys. Robas Lys, daugiau žinomas jums iš socialinių tinklų, iš Twitterio, iš podcastų, bet gal tada mes jį ir pristatykime. Rob, it's good to have you here. Really appreciate it that you had a chance to come to our little studio.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, I briefly introduced you in Lithuanian, but I thought that maybe you should it's better for you to introduce yourself. I mean, who you are, what do you do, and how did you end up in Ukraine of all places?
Sure. I mean, it's a long story, but so I was in the U.S. Marines. So I joined in, well, I went active in 2008, but I went through officer camp school before then, and I was an infantry officer. I did a deployment on a MU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit. So I was on a ship. You know, we this is 2009. So we went, across the Pacific, and then this was back when Al Qaeda was a big issue in Yemen, and so we were off the coast of Yemen, Somalia for about 4 months. Came home, went to Afghanistan, was in Marja and Garmshire during the surge, and then my last deployment was to Georgia, the country Georgia. So I trained the 31st Light Infantry Battalion, because the Georgians were deploying to Afghanistan, and they're deploying alongside U.S. Marines in Helmand Province, and so U.S. Marines go and train them. So I spent 2 months outside Tbilisi, and then 1 month at Hohenfels training the Georgian battalion, and then I got out, did a master's degree, decided to kind of focus on Eurasia more or less, and then while I was doing my master's degree, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. So it made, this kind of focus, even kind of more important. And then after my degree at Columbia, I did a year in Russia on a fellowship. And then I started doing a PhD on focus on Russian defense policy. And that's what I was doing when the war began. I tracked the buildup. I tracked things on social media before all this. And I kind of watched the buildup in the spring and fall of 2021. And, concluded at some point that we'd probably see some kind of invasion. And then, the war began, and, basically it's all I've done ever since then. So, focus on the war. I write about the war. I moved to Ukraine last year. I started going to Ukraine every 3 or 4 months, in February 2023. I'll be there for the foreseeable future. Again, it's Ukraine is kind of where everything is happening, right? Yeah. For everything modern warfare, for everything obviously Russian military. The experts are all there in Ukraine, and it's a terrible war. But as a defense analyst, right, there's an opportunity when you get in Ukraine because you get to meet all these incredible people with such experience.
You consider yourself a defense analyst. What's your reaction when people call you an expert? Because people on this show, they know that I rarely give this sort of a name, an expert, to just anybody, because everybody is called an expert these days, especially since 2022.
Sure.
Well, when they call you an expert, is that a fair assessment, do you think?
I mean, I'm okay with it, but I wouldn't call myself, expert on this. I mean, again, analyst, I think there's less of a maybe inflated connotation when you say that.
How's your Russian, by the way? Better than Alec Baldwin's in Hunting for Red October?
Yes, better than that. I need to have the Scottish accent, I think, to really perfect it. But no, I mean, I think it's a different conversation, but it is interesting when we talk about expertise on things, because a war, wars are so complex that there's no one that's an expert on everything, right? And my background is as an infantry Marine. That gave me some useful experience, but I don't know aviation that well. Yeah. I don't know, in this war, obviously drones are playing a huge role. The radio spectrum is one of the most important aspects, and I don't know nearly enough about it. And then, when it talks about OSINT, there are all these accounts who don't necessarily have credentials, but are great at, mapping, great at identifying things, all these kind of things. And so, when the war began, because I followed these things before the war, a lot of people followed me initially. And, I post videos less often now, partially because back then I'm like, hey, no one else is necessarily going to do it. And I can at least identify some things and maybe give context. And now there's better people at identifying Russian equipment than me at this point, right? There are guys who are just very, very, very good at this. I'm not great at geolocating things, and so that's not something I can do. I'm not great at mapping or geospatial kind of visualizations. And so for all these kind of things, there are better people at it than I am. I benefit from all these kind of analysis you have. And like, again, with the recent kind of middle strike campaign, you have guys who are geolocating things, mapping it, providing this really good picture, and then I'll analyze it, but it's really based on the work of other people. And so I think, expertise is an interesting word when we talk about this, because I kind of look at this and I realize there's a lot of things I don't know, and I benefit from other people who have a lot of expertise that like really informs, my analysis and informs what I'm doing. So yeah, I usually go with a term that has less, maybe impressive connotations, because I don't think I'm doing anything that is particularly impressive, and particularly for wars, it's really the guys who are fighting. That's what's really impressive about all this. I'm not fighting, and so it's hard to think that I have any kind of impressive stature.
Maybe you came into the really sort of spotlight back in 2021 when the big build-up started to show up, and your name, Michael Kaufman's name popped up a lot, Konrad Musikan. Those guys I mentioned, you collaborated with them. Either on podcasts or going to Ukraine on those trips. But this specific thing, going on those field trips, how exactly does that work? Could you explain it to us? Because you're not just a random guy from the street, hey, brigade this X, I want to visit you and talk to you. Can you just give us more insight?
I mean, so anytime I go to anyone in the front, I make requests, right? So I make requests to the operational commands, the same way I think journalists do. I have to get credentials, so you get credentials, so you're allowed to kind of travel, and then I'll submit requests where I say, these are the units I want to meet with. The commands will get back and say, yes or no. They usually say yes to pretty much all brigades.
You think because they know you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably part of it. It's certainly over time, trust was a big part of it, because when you develop this. But even if you get approved to meet with units, in some cases brigades will reach out to you and say like we're ready to meet you. In other cases, you have to kind of find their press officer and ask them. And some brigades will just say we're not really interested, or we're busy. And of course, like they're fighting, so it's it's completely a legitimate reason. And so it really depends on the unit. Some units are happy to talk. Some units are not as happy to talk. I'm not a journalist, and so when I go, it's off the record conversation. Some units will say, okay, we see value in explaining these things. Some units don't see it that way. So there's no kind of uniform response. But typically, because I've gone enough times, and I don't know the full number at this point, but you meet brigades, you go back, you meet them again. The first time, they don't necessarily know what a think tank analyst is. Maybe they think you're a journalist or something else. And then over time, they kind of realize, okay, we know what kind of questions you're going to ask. I'm not going to ask, political questions. I'm not going to ask you, how do you feel about, politicians, so on. I'm interested in lessons learned. I'm interested in things with the Russian military. And usually, military guys are happy to talk about those things, and kind of explaining, and again, I go there as someone who's like, I want to learn from you about what should, NATO learn from about modern warfare. And usually the guys are very happy to explain this. And again, like I go as a former Marine, and so like here's the questions I have as like a former company commander of like, how would you do defensive operations, offensive operations? How do you integrate drones? How do you prevent friendly fire? All the kind of planning considerations. There's so many things that are interesting. So over time, you just kind of learn to trust you, and then once they kind of know who you are, then it's easier to set up meetings. Or you meet someone, and then their friends meet with you because their friends kind of vouch for you. So I'd say the early trips were much less successful because we met fewer people, and people were not as open to talking. Over time, just the number of people who were willing to talk, increased a lot. But look, it's all on their own initiative. If they want to talk, they can. They don't have to. No one's ordering them to do so. And it's always a privilege to be able to meet these guys, and talk to them.
What kind of impact do you think those talks does? Talks with the brigades, with the people there, talks like the Two Marines podcast, because people are watching. Your audience, right? It's across the world, obviously, but it's also in Ukraine. And what kind of impact do you think that's maybe one day the commander-in-chief of Armed Forces of Ukraine will just, hey, come along and let's talk.
Yeah, I mean,
so expectation.
So look, I'm not a journalist, which is a benefit there. Where exactly. I don't feel need to ask you certain types of questions, and I'm interested in the military side of this. So it's really explain the military dynamics. I'm not going to ask about other things like that, and that makes it a little easier. now I'm working with a Ukrainian colleague who just demobilized from the military, Dmitry Putyata, and it's useful working with him because he looks at things through a different lens. He's Ukrainian, and so everything, his perspective is going to be very different than mine. Obviously, we've got, we're both Marines, we're both combat veterans, but I like being able to work with him because he's going to ask things that I want to ask and has a different kind of view on things. And it's good when we have the same opinion because then it kind of like, okay, we're coming from different directions on this. For the podcast, a lot of times I'll come back and I'll just try and explain, here's what, the people at the front line are telling me that I'm hearing. Here's the kind of overall view of how things are changing, what the tactics are changing, the character of the fighting is changing. And again, it comes back to, here are lessons learned for, other countries, for NATO countries, U.S. military, so on. In a lot of cases, different NATO militaries have different restrictions on where their members can go. And so many of them cannot go near the front line. And so many of them cannot see a brigade command post, right? Or see what a battalion command post looks like. Whereas I can go there, right? And then I can go there as a former Marine and say, this is what's interesting to me. Here are things that I'm like, we definitely need to learn about this.
For example. So
Ukraine there's a lot to learn, but Ukraine has really impressive command and control software. So Delta, Veja, SkyMap, Graphite, Neon, all these systems, right? They're very, very good for situational awareness. And the U.S. has its own system. I got out of the military a long time ago, so things that I don't know, but I think there are a lot of these systems, the software they have. I think this would make a lot of sense for a lot of NATO militaries too, and it provides very good situational awareness at the lower level, where guys on their phones, on their laptops, have access and kind of can basically do mission planning, can look at where Russian targets are. They can have very good situational awareness what their adjacent units are doing. Veja is this app that streams all UAV footage, and so it's not just you; it's also your higher unit, your subordinate unit attached, adjacent units. You can see all this footage, and maybe 50, 60 UAVs on one part of the front line, and it just gives you a really tremendous kind of situational awareness. In some cases, you don't need to do as much coordination because you can see what adjacent unit's seeing, and then you can, if you're an artillery unit, you can decide to fire a mission based on your other, your adjacent unit's kind of UAV footage, or send FPVs or what have you. And so I think that's been really impressive to see how they do this. The mentality is different too because with the software, it's pushed down to a much lower level than the U.S. military would be comfortable with because we're much more comfortable, much more focused on kind of classified information leaking. And it's a bigger concern. But I do think it is an important kind of discussion to have about what is the risk and benefit of pushing down more information at the lowest level because you enable decentralized operations to a way that we can't do right now. And I think in potentially Lithuania's case, this probably makes more sense. And I think a lot of what Ukraine is doing. And again, if you compare, to what extent should Lithuania learn from the U.S. military, Ukrainian military, there's probably a lot of things that they should learn from the Ukrainian military more than the U.S. military in some cases. The way they're fighting, obviously, Russia is the same kind of threat, but it's a smaller country fighting a bit bigger country. They show how to do this. So anyway, there's a number of really interesting things they do. There are also some things that we shouldn't learn from, I think, that might be particular to their case. Maybe doesn't make sense from NATO, maybe doesn't make sense for the U.S. military or so on. And so it's really important kind of drawing back these lessons and kind of figuring out, okay, what makes sense for us, what doesn't make sense for us, and how should we kind of draw back these lessons?
Now, looking, you have the privilege and benefit watching the war from very close distance, watching for the far distance, like here in Lithuania. At least I have one simple rule. Do not get overly optimistic. That's since 2022, especially since the counterattacks, Ukrainian counterattacks, successful ones. And then don't get into despair. How does that work in 2026 for you? You're more an optimist or pessimist in between? Where do you draw the line here?
Sure. So Russia's had this initiative since 2023, right? So since October, November 2023. Where they've been, broadly on offense, and Ukraine has been on defense. The good news is that Russia has not achieved a breakthrough, right? Russia has advanced. They've captured some cities. They've captured territory, but they have not broken through. There hasn't been a collapse, anything along those lines. The good news is, and there's a lot of talk about, is it a turning point? Is Ukraine winning? Are they losing? How do you frame it? I don't like those terms because
I'm from the media. I know the clickbaits.
Right.
So
it's difficult because they have connotations, and so it really depends what you mean. So when we say turning point, for example, is Ukraine now? Do they now have the initiative? Right? Are they now going to be mostly taking back territory and Russia's on defense? Maybe, but it's not fully clear we're at that point yet. Because right now we're seeing Ukraine counterattack in some directions, we're seeing Russia advance in other directions. I do think, though, the dynamic is better now than it was a year ago. And so, one thing I mentioned is that there's a really strong seasonal dimension to the fighting. Russia prefers infiltration tactics. That means, 1, 2, 3 Russian soldiers are moving forward at a time, often 10, 15, 20 kilometers of walking. And in the summertime, right, when you've got foliage, when you have tree lines, it's harder for UAVs to spot these guys. Yeah. So a higher percentage of these guys will make it past Ukrainian lines. It's easy to survive, obviously. If you're not getting as much food and water, you can dig in tree lines, right? Whereas in the wintertime, it's a very cold winter, you have to find a basement to survive. And so we knew that infiltration typically is better suited to summer months than it is winter months. And so we knew this, this winter, when Russia was advancing slower, that was normal. The question is, when the foliage comes back, are their advances still going to decline, or are they going to increase again? And we're not seeing an increase in Russia rate advance, right? And that's the good news. That basically, compared to a year ago, the situation very clearly is better. We're into the summer, and Russia is not advancing faster. We're seeing Ukraine kind of push back in some directions. Ukraine is intercepting a higher percentage of Shaheds right now, so they're doing quite well with that. Ballistic missile defense is obviously the big problem they have. But on the front line, generally, the situation is better than it was a year ago. Manpower is still a big challenge, and the Ukrainian units know this. I think the situation has probably improved a little bit, but it's still, a vulnerability. There are indications that Russia's having issues with their recruitment. So I think they are recruiting more soldiers than they're losing this year, but not significantly. And so they can probably sustain the current kind of intensity of fighting if the trend continues. But the trend right now is not enabling it's not a decisive advantage. It's not enabling any kind of rapid advances. I think Ukraine has figured out at tactical level the two kind of big adaptations Russia had last year, which is infiltration tactics, 1, and 2 is kind of improved employment of UAVs, and in particular with more elite units, really going after kind of tactical interdiction, trying to go after Ukraine logistics. When they did this last year, it was a really big problem in Kursk and other places. And Ukrainian units have figured this out. They know how to do logistics now. They know how to kind of defend against this. And so, Russia really needs to change its approach. It's not clear if they know how to do this. I think what's interesting this year is that both sides kind of concluded that some kind of operational depth strike campaign was going to be a priority. And so, sorry.
No, it's okay. I thought we were going to come back to the interdiction campaign that you just mentioned, but one of the key aspects that you probably didn't touch, but you were speaking before, others also were talking about that, it's a manpower issue, manpower problem in the Ukrainian side. And recently it's being compensated in a way, at least people say that it's being compensated by the UAVs, UGVs, USVs, etc., etc. The sort of proponents and opponents, they often clash in their opinions, and one side says that, well, the drones, largely, broadly, they cannot hold terrain, but they can deny terrain. They can resupply, they can be used for various tasks today, and yet they are not enough. Is this a thing that the manpower issue being solved by these systems truly prevailing sort of a trend? Is that a way forward, or is that just a Ukrainian and Russian way forward in this particular war?
So the fighting is positional, and so you've had a development of the kill zone, and it's kind of the dynamic. Let's keep in mind that in 2022 this is not the case. And if there's a new war, right, where Russia invades another country or so on, the kill zone is not going to exist, right? There's not going to be fortifications, not going to be these kind of things. You have this sophisticated system already set up, and maneuver will still be possible. And look, I think maneuver is still possible now. Drones are playing a really important role. As you said, Ukraine has very few infantry holding the front line, right? Drones are really compensating. In reality, drones are doing most of the hold in the front line, responsible for most of the reconnaissance, most of the strike. Infantry, very few of the engagements are infantry and infantry fights. One of the core surgeons told me that about 2 or 3% of his casualties are from small arms, so it's very, very small percentage. And so drones are really compensating, but this also creates vulnerabilities, right? And so, again, traditional way, way I was taught, way you do defense, for an infantry unit, you have, fire teams, squad positions, you have crew serve weapons, you have interlocking fields of fire with machine guns and like mortars and ATGMs. You don't have that anymore, right? Because drones have kind of just, supplanted a lot of those things. And so Ukraine will have, obviously don't have any infantry. They don't necessarily have infantry with, tied in positions. They don't necessarily have it, a defense in depth either. There aren't like necessarily, medium, heavy machine gun positions. And mortars, usually it's 120s, less than that, they don't always have them. The same thing is true on the Russian side. And so for Russian defenses, I don't think Russian lines are that strong. And that's one reason why I think, it's potential that Ukraine could, have some success if they go on offense. Because, Russia, they have a manpower advantage. Their forward-line infantry is not that strong. They don't really spend too much time training their infantry. You get, a few weeks. The front line is kind of held by UAVs. It's by Mavics, by FPVs. An assumption Ukraine lacks the offensive potential manpower to really, conduct an offensive operation. But, Russia doesn't necessarily have, again, the medium machine gun positions. They don't have the ATGM position necessarily. Their tanks and IFVs are far behind. They're not used as an infantry role as much. And they don't necessarily have a second line, third line of defenses, right? So this conception of the 2023 summer offensive, where Russia had 2 kilometers of minefields, and then they had very dense fortifications. You had lots of infantry, lots of guys rotate. They don't have that the same way anymore because they're focused on offense. Russian units are given unrealistic timetables of how fast they're supposed to advance, and they're kind of throwing guys forward in order to kind of make up with this. And so, if you can sufficiently degrade, suppress, destroy drone positions, there's no reason you can't use armor again, right? And I think that's the kind of point I'm making, where drones are playing a very important role. But it's also vulnerability because they aren't relying on those other kind of traditional forms of defense, and it's not impossible to suppress drone teams. It's not impossible to locate them. It really is. We're in this kind of moment, which I kind of compare to World War I. It's not a great analogy, but FPVs when they came initially, I think they really favored defense. It's easier to defend with them. You don't need as much kind of coordination. But to go on offense, you need new tactics, maybe some other new technologies like counter UAV turrets, which are also developing. But I think those things are coming along. We're seeing the kind of innovation also on task organization, where, and this is one thing that's notable, the Ukrainian assault regiments, the ratio of drone operators, drone teams to infantry is often like 3 or 4 to 1, right? Mm-hmm. It's more, in the fires piece than infantry. And that, even with Ukraine's manpower issues, even a small amount of infantry can potentially breach Russian lines and get pretty far past them if you have that advantage in fires. And I think that's what UAVs are they're moving in that direction where you might be able to, get this kind of localized, superiority. So I went a bit of a tangent there, but, we're still early in the era of drone warfare, right? Mm-hmm. We're still figuring this out. It's early in AI and all these other kind of things. I don't know where all these things are going to go. But I do think that, a lot of things are still possible. I think people have kind of jumped to the conclusion that there's a persistent or transparent battlefield. I don't think that's necessarily true, and I think there's still a lot of things we're going to see this year and future innovations.
You kind of jumped a couple of questions ahead of me, but I just wanted to dwell on them still, because a couple of weeks ago you quoted an Economist article, Dangerous Delusions of Modern Warfare, and you mentioned something that you pretty much mentioned today, right now, the pockets of superiority when you can basically suppress the drones. Then you can use maneuver, you can use armor, but you have to use artillery. So that kind of answers the questions, do Ukrainians believe in the armor? They still do, as I understand, right? But then the question is, because you mentioned First World War, 1918, the summer offensive, when there was a really combined arms effort. It was not just the tanks moving, not just artillery, not just the infantry, lots of them. It was just combined effort, and combined with the weakening that we're talking about the Western Front, obviously combined with a weakened German army, expanded German army with lots of casualties, the Allies could push on massive scale in various directions at various points and put the pressure eventually which led through the 100 days offensive until the 11th of November. Now, my question is, those little pockets of superiority at the moment which are being tested, have been tested, do you think they are possible on a larger scale in Ukraine for the Ukrainian side, and what would be the conditions? What are the conditions necessary to have that sort of a 100 days offensive? Shall we put the poor analogy, but nonetheless, because there is a lack of the better ones.
So, in terms of conditions, right? So Ukraine. One of the ways they've changed their kind of military structure last few years is that they developed these assault regiments, right? They were battalions. They kind of had different backgrounds of how they developed, but they were mostly kind of volunteer units that became assault battalions, and General Syrskyi made it a real priority, and they became assault regiments. In reality, they're like division size. Some of them, they're very, very big, and basically the way General Syrskyi employs them is that they're his kind of strategic QRF, right? So if there's a gap in the lines where there's Russians are breaking through somewhere, you'll send these units because they're very well manned, they have the best equipment, and they're going to hold the line, right? And they get some criticism about taking unnecessary losses. They counterattack too often. There are different types of criticism, also about the way they do training. But ultimately, they are units that are going to fight, and they're going to hold the line. And so some of these units are used basically cohesively, where like the regiments together. In other cases, like Scala Regiment, one of the well-knowns, they could be operating on 8 or 9 parts of the front line, right? They'll have battalions all over the place to plug in these gaps, because again, we know the Ukrainian brigades are mostly undermanned. And this is one way that Ukraine developed this solution to try and fix it. When those units are being used to plug gaps, they don't have time to prepare for offensive operations, right? Because they're being used defensively. And so, this year, there are a couple of different developments, but the core reform has been a beneficial one. But one of the kind of questions, if the brigades can hold the front line themselves, so they don't need these assault regiments doing reinforcements, then you can pull them back, give them time to kind of, plan, prepare for an offensive operation, do some cohesion training, and then maybe you have better conditions, right? And so, Ukraine had the successful counterattack in Kupiansk last fall. That was led by Code 9.2 and Hartia for the most part. And then in Huyapoya in January and February, we saw a counterattack by a couple of air assault brigades, a couple of assault regiments. And each kind of assault regiment does things differently, but the Huyapoya operation was only about a week or a week and a half of planning. And again, back then, the Russians had pushed in the Kodėl direction. They were sent down there to kind of stabilize the front. This year, if those units have more time to be pulled back to do preparations, I think they have a better chance at achieving not necessarily a breakthrough, but achieving kind of success in offensive operations. And that's one of the reasons why I think there's a better opportunity. But you're also seeing these units are changing task organization, right? So Code 9.2 and 1st Assault Regiment, they created the Phalanx multi-domain kind of fires unit. It's a way of just integrating fires in a more effective way. Code 9.2 is a unique one because its background was not really an infantry unit, it was more of a drone unit that became a drone assault unit. And so they really leaning on the drone side very heavily. This is already kind of shown publicly, but that unit has FP2s, right? These big middle strike drones with like a 250-pound warhead. Those can be used against bridges when they're right now hitting the Chongar Bridge and they're trying to isolate Crimea. And of course, this is one way you might set conditions to go on offense, right? You cut off logistics, trying to isolate part of the objective. Because they're getting these kind of middle strike components, they have an ability to do interdiction at not only tactical level but operational level. And again, I think drones can also enable maneuver just as they've kind of become a difficulty for maneuver. And because these units are being very well kind of funded, they're getting a lot of in the way of equipment. And I think that they're figuring out how to do this, right? How to do, assaults in the drone era, where you lean very heavily on the drones and you bring up infantry once drones have kind of set the conditions. And so I think, there are different ways to do this. Infiltration, I think, I think the Russians conceptually, I don't think they were wrong last year or this year. Right? Last year, they kind of figured out the center of gravity for Ukrainian military at a task level is UAV teams. And so with Rubicon and other units, they focus all on UAV teams, so suppressing, destroying. So Russian artillery, mostly directed at UAV teams, glide bombs, other things. Where they really focus, they decide infantry is not that important. We have to go after UAV teams to establish maneuver. They didn't succeed because the execution wasn't there. But the idea, I think, was right. And other than that, it was tactical interdiction of logistics, right? So they set up kind of the drone line where they're going after different, echelons of Ukrainian logistics, again, to try and, maybe, set the conditions. And they tried this in Doropolia last year. It was a big priority in August, September, October. They pulled all the Navy infantry brigades and regiments in that direction. They deployed like 4 or 5 Rubicon attachments, all the big priority. They weren't able to achieve it, right? Because Ukraine also redeployed their best UAV units there too, and basically Russia was not able to set conditions to achieve like overmatch. The concept, I think, was right. And again, also in January, the Russians tried a kind of operational interdiction campaign when they started putting Starlinks on Molnia, on BM-35, so on, and they're hitting fuel trucks on the road from Pavlograd to Petropavlovka and elsewhere. And I remember I was there at the end of January at the front, and it was a big concern. It was a new kind of development until they lost access to Starlink. And that loss meant they technically just don't have the capacity to do the kind of middle strike campaign. But I think that the concept there was right. And Ukraine is in some ways doing a very similar thing, where they're also doing a middle strike campaign to interdict Russian logistics.
And they have Starlink.
They have Starlink, which is a huge, huge advantage. But with the operational interdiction campaign, and I talked to some units doing it, they're trying to obviously deny fuel getting the front line, which obviously uses for generators, for all sorts of things. Trying to make sure units have less ammunition, right? So artillery units have fewer rounds on station. FPV teams have fewer FPVs there, right? And again, the way this can work, if you can locate UAV positions, it doesn't have to be perfect, and you have some idea, but you can locate them with SIGINT, with ISR, other forms of reconnaissance. You can then try to grade them before an operation. So you remote mine the kind of ground lines of communication behind them. And then the Russians will clear this every day or two, but you can keep doing that. You can go after those warehouses. You can do operational interdiction too. You do it at different kind of echelons. And then for the operation itself, you can suppress these things. And again, artillery plays a role. You can have artillery just fire at these areas where you think there are UAV positions. Most FPV teams might have 1, 2, 3 antenna. And so if you destroy the antenna, they might need someone to come in and bring them a new one. Okay, well, you remote mine the roads, you make that difficult. And so again, suppression, kind of denial with remote mining, those kind of things can really be effective. And again, you can suppress UAV positions. Also, FP2s are a useful addition because Ukraine, they have aviation, but the glide bombs can only be used so far past the front line, right? FP2s almost serve that same role because it's huge ammunition. If you know where a Mavic team is, even in fortification, a 250-pound ammunition can still do a lot of damage. And so some of these units are using FP2s, near the FLOT to go after these kind of UAV positions. And again, if you mass the best UAV capabilities, the best kind of infantry units, as well as armor, you can achieve a lot. And so again, in the execution, it's not easy, but if you take time to plan, you do rehearsals, you think through all these options, you set conditions through preparation of the battlefield, through remote mining, for everything else, I think it can be achieved. And again, will we see it? I don't know. We know that Ukraine has a big manpower problem.
Could that be a sort of a different purpose? Because when we look at the interdiction campaign, right? The natural sort of a belief, and again, this is jumping into the optimistic sort of camp. The natural belief is that they are going for the breakthrough. They are going to just punch the armor straight to the Melitopol, straight to the Berdansk, etc., cut off Crimea totally, and there will be victory by Christmas. That sort of talk. Obviously, the skeptic in me would say, wait. That does not necessarily.
Right.
There may be other options. What are the the other options for the Ukrainian campaign here, possibly, and especially when you're saying that we're looking at the Ukrainian mid-range drone attacks against Russian logistics, and we focus, especially in the media, we focus on the fuel trucks, that sort of stuff.
Right.
But then you mention little things that also matter in the front. Without those little things, without antenna, the whole sector of the front can crumble.
Yeah, and I didn't answer your other question about the relative pessimism, optimism, but I'll get into that. So, the full extent of what this campaign will achieve, I don't know, is the short answer. At a minimum, it's going to degrade Russian offensive potential, right? And so, and again, when I was there at the front, 2.5 weeks ago, units were broadly optimistic. And again, it depends where you are. Some places where the Russians are pushing just as they have before, they're in a very critical situation. There was a broad sense of optimism that Middle Strike was having success and that we'd see results in the future, and that we'd see Russia have more difficulty getting ammunition to the front and other things, right? So, again, there might be different areas where interdiction units in Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, right, a lot of their supplies came from Crimea. If Crimea is kind of cut off, then that might become a bigger problem. Maybe supplies in Luhansk direction, Kharkiv direction is okay for Russia because it's near the border, but maybe running the kind of land bridge is going to be too difficult with all the Hornet flights, right? What does it lead to? I don't know. The Russians are trying to adapt, so they're putting up kind of mobile air defense teams, mobile air defense groups. They are deploying Starlink jammers, and my understanding is that Starlink jammers are having some success. It does have some effects. They've been testing these since like 2024. Yeah. And so again, we might see Ukraine's middle strike campaign to not be as effective as it is today in the future. But the quantities of drones they're producing is really significant. And so again, Russia is going to come with countermeasures. They always do. There always is adaptation cycle, as you said. I think overall, though, we have a new phase where Ukraine has a middle strike capability. I don't think Russia is going to be able to solve it entirely. And even if they do have kind of solutions, they have to pull resources back, right? Resources from the front line to try and defend these kind of roads. They didn't have to do that before. A lot of their equipment that hid in Donetsk City, they've now moved into a big forest. They have to operate in a kind of different way. Crimea, ultimately they're having difficulties protecting military sites in Crimea, right? And then again, there's a military dimension, there's a political dimension. The military side, maybe they have difficulty, resupplying the front lines of Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and they can't advance, as fast. Maybe it's just conditions for offensive operation, right? Maybe it's tactical level, maybe it's greater. It's hard to tell right now what could be achieved. But also there's the political dimension, right? We know that Crimea is very important to Putin. It was one of his signature kind of foreign policy accomplishments, the way he views it. And now, Crimea is not, again, in Russian thinking, it was this kind of unsinkable aircraft carrier for Black Sea. We can dominate the Black Sea from having it. And now, much of the Black Sea obviously got pulled back to Novorossiysk. They have air bases there, but those things can get hit, pretty often. They have a difficulty, obviously, with fuel supplies, other things. Now it's looking more like a liability. And, maybe Russia will adapt to this, but it's now becoming somewhat costly. And I think, again, part of this comes back to this idea, will Putin, will he be willing to negotiate at some point? I don't know the answer, right? Maybe he'll just commit to this war until he collapses, Russia collapses or someone collapses. Maybe he will come to this understanding that, okay, I've met diminishing returns this war. We're not advancing much on the battlefield. The costs are increasing. Crimea is at risk. I should make some kind of deal because...
That's like a suicide. Or maybe he will use nuke. I mean, that's what people are saying. That's what a lot of people in Russia are saying, especially, the war bloggers, observers, etc. You've been there. You spent some time in Russia, and you've probably been observing what they are talking. Do you have any opinion about them? Is there anyone who is not, paranoid psychopath, but who is rational that you would actually listen and you would say, read this guy, listen to this guy, because his opinions may matter, or everyone is just a bit crazy? Because the way I'm looking at those over the past couple of days, they just want to nuke everyone from Kiev to Europe to London, etc.
Right. So, Vasily Kashin had an interesting article in, I think it's Russian Global Affairs Journal a week or two ago, where he kind of argued, like, we've achieved what we could achieve in this war, and, we should probably kind of make some kind of deal at this point. And again, he's not like an anti-war person, I think, and so on. But I think he kind of argues, okay, like, from a strategic perspective, we're not going to be able to achieve more than we have. Let's call it a victory, and let's address our other kind of threats. My understanding, there are other Russian generals who also have these concerns. They see the threat environment kind of getting worse. The Russian military is entirely tied down in this war. They can't respond to other things. Again, I think Russia is in a position where strategically ending the war sooner rather than later is going to be better for them. I think they reach diminishing returns. But the question all along has been, it's Putin, though. Putin is the one who decided on this war. He's the one who keeps kind of doubling down. And of course, it's not just him. Russians in general, are still going along with the war. But it comes back to his understanding of the situation, right? Is he getting accurate information of what's happening? What does he think is achievable? And that's really hard to predict. But he's doubled down on this war every opportunity. And even at the point where strategically, their losses, the Assad regime was lost, his relationship with like Armenia and elsewhere, kind of Russia's lost some foreign policy places. And they've been willing to sustain really heavy costs for this war. And it comes back to this assumption of he doesn't have the same kind of cost-benefit analysis, that we would say is maybe rational, right? And because the costs are growing. And obviously Ukraine is a strong fixation for him. I think it's obviously Donetsk region taking all of it is really strong fixation beyond what is maybe strategically rational. And so again, it's hard to say what things he might do. I think there's a possibility that Ukraine could take the initiative again, right? Could start pushing back Russian forces if they can't adapt to this, to this middle strike campaign. They could face some really big issues. And then we get back to this discussion of how would Putin respond?
It's like 2022 again, when the successful counteroffensive happened, and then when there was a talk about tactical nuclear or non-strategic nuclear weapon being used, it was not used because of various reasons. I guess two questions then here remain. In military point of view, is there military utility of the nuclear weapon in Ukraine being used by the Russians? Because strategic, we can talk till the end of the day. And we'll not get a definitive answer because we don't really know. But from the military point of view, is there a utility here at this point if the Ukrainians, say, commit some breakthroughs?
I mean, the question is about tactical nuke weapons, essentially. And the debate, I think, before was whether or not Russia would drop one on an airbase somewhere, right? That might be the type of target they go after. I mean, they struggle to, obviously, they've struggled to knock out the Ukrainian Air Force. They've not knocked out these kind of air bases and knocked out the fighters. A tactical nuke weapon could have an effect against that if they went that direction. But obviously, if they did this, it would be more about signaling. It'd be more about strategically signaling that we are willing to escalate further beyond your risk tolerance. And again, I don't know the likelihood. I think the Biden people said that was like a 50% chance that Russia might use, and I think that was their assessment. I have no idea what the intelligence picture looked like. I don't know what the briefings were like. Easy for me to say because I'm not responsible for it. So how likely would Russia be? I don't know. I do think though that I would not be surprised if Russia does try to escalate in different directions if the war starts to really get reversed, because we've seen Putin just double down in many kind of cases, and it's very, very clear. This is very, very important.
Can you define different directions?
I don't know.
That sounds scary being here, or at least
And I think that's been mentioned is that maybe Russia escalates in the Baltics in some respects, which
would be insane considering they don't have the manpower and nothing really to escalate against NATO. So this sort of counter argument plays along with each other, and we never reach anywhere near to some answer.
Right, and again, look, the conventional disparity is greater now than it was before for Russia because their forces is tied down Ukraine. They're having issues in Ukraine. The limited force they could commit to anything in the Baltics would have a very big issue fighting NATO. So, again, I think what they would try to do if they tried to escalate in some way is to try and basically demonstrate to Ukraine's foreign supporters that we have a risk tolerance that you don't have. We're willing to risk everything for this, and you need to back down. You need to cut off support to Ukraine. It could be something along the lines where they try and get the Trump administration to cut off Starlink, right, or intelligence sharing, and those things are quite important for Ukraine still.
How would that impact? I mean, Ukrainians always seem to have a plan B at least, but sometimes it just happens and there are problems. Now they're very much dependent on Starlink, just like the Russians were, right, for various reasons. And if, say, Russians escalate either nuclear or non-nuclear and get Elon Musk or Trump administration to cut off intelligence support or Starlink at least, connection, then what for Ukrainians? Do they have a plan B, do you think?
Starlink would be a big loss because Starlink is an integral way Ukraine fights. It's an integral part of just drone warfare as we understand it from this war. It's used on almost all UGVs, and when Russia lost it, their UGV usage declined dramatically because they used it as well. It's used on naval drones. It's used on obviously plenty of the middle strike drones. We see this on Hornets, on Batons, on Bliskavka, so on. And it's a very cheap option, right? Where again, a Bliskavka, which is like a Molnia type, $500 drone, you put a Starlink terminal on it, and you can now it's a precision guided munition basically. You can hit things at operational depth, right? And so it's made darts and Bliskavka much more effective. And then it streams all the footage. Right? Every UAV position will have it. Every command post has it. And so you enable this great situation awareness. You enable Veja to operate because all these UAV feeds are streamed with good latency, and you can see everything. So without Starlink, you lose that. Russia's adapted since they lost it. They use Wi-Fi bridges and other things, but those things you have to put much higher up on radio towers. You can't have anything in front of it, or else it blocks the feed. It's hard to get satellite connection. It's either located and destroyed and so on. And so if Ukraine lost it, it would have a really serious effect because, again, Ukraine is compensating for lack of manpower through drones, right? Through UGVs, through UAVs, so on. If they lose Starlink, the effectiveness of that drone ecosystem declines, quite significantly. And so that would pose really big challenges. It wouldn't need to collapse or anything necessarily, but it would really make it more difficult. It's certainly make it more difficult to go offense again. And in terms of intelligence sharing is still important. The Ukrainians, I know that they still think this is an important form of support. There's an irony where you compare the Biden and Trump administrations, the support for Ukraine, where the Biden administration provided a lot of equipment and without the same kind of charge. But there's more concern about escalation risk. Whereas the Trump administration, they're only providing things through the Pearl system for the most part. But then there's not the escalation concerns as Ukraine hits, targets all across Russia, right, hit in Crimea. And there's still the intel sharing is still going. And so there is this very interesting dynamic. But those things are important. And if Ukraine lost it, it would have an effect on their ability to fight the war.
One more thing that bugs me that you actually mentioned, that Putin may be lied to by his generals. I mean, this is popular opinion, right? Everybody lies in Russia since, hundreds of years. It's Tsarist tradition. Everybody lies to everybody. And yet, how is it possible in 2026 that Putin, the head of state of Russian Federation, is being lied and he cannot get alternative solutions, alternative sources? I mean, he got briefed by even war bloggers who said, listen, Mr. President, this is not the situation like the generals who are lying to you, making a point. This is a real situation. And yet we see that he's oblivious of everything. And it seems that we are winning. The special military operation is going on, and the targets will be reached accordingly. How is that even possible? I mean, and more importantly, I guess, how can Ukraine still use that? Because we are constantly talking on the 3rd anniversary of Prigozhin mutiny, and Ukraine back then did not use the mutiny, well, at least in fully. And today, when Putin is being lied to, someone, might even try something more than just lying. But it didn't happen. So how is it possible?
Lying in militaries is a problem for all militaries. Yeah. And there was an article written in 2015 by 2 U.S. Army War College professors about how the U.S. military lies to itself. We incentivize lying, and we did this in Afghanistan, we did this in Iraq, and I think it's led to some of our political issues where we were not told the truth. There was not complete honesty, and it also led to some, issues internal in the U.S. military of how junior people kind of saw senior officers and so on. Right. Obviously, Russia is way worse. Right? Ukraine has a problem too. Right? Yeah. And this has been an issue when I go there, where units are not allowed to withdraw. And what often happen if a unit loses a position because they don't have enough people to hold it, they'll automatically be ordered to counterattack. They don't necessarily have the people to counterattack. And so commanders will either not acknowledge they lost a position because they don't want to have to refuse an order, or because they don't get relieved. And they'll get relieved if they lose a position. And so then a lot of times units will not know where the front line is. Adjacent units will get attacked from the flank because their adjacent unit did not tell the truth. And I heard dozens of anecdotes of soldiers being sent to the front line to rotate out guys who are at the front line, only to find out Russians held this position, they get shot at on the way there. I literally dozens of times. On the Russian side, it's much worse. And so I remember I met with an intelligence officer up in the Kupiansk direction last October when Kodėl kind of came out and said, we have, basically, I think initially he said we've encircled the city. We haven't captured it fully, but we've got 18 Ukrainian battalions who are encircled. And we were there the day of this meeting. And the intel officer we met with was in Kupiansk the day prior. And so he sent us a photo. He showed us photos hey, look, I was in Kupiansk yesterday. I can demonstrate to you that we're not encircled. And yet the briefings happen. And I asked him, to what extent is this, does he know the real truth? And his estimate is that 50% information that gets passed to the Russian chain of command is not true. It's not accurate. And that's starting at company battalion level all the way up. In some cases with SIGINT, they can see this. They can see false information get sent. Sometimes they'll know, we'll see Russians report up how many positions they have, and the Ukrainians will say, we've already killed these 4 teams. So we know they don't have these positions, and always ends. Also, in 2 other cases I know of, when the naval infantry brigades got redirected to the Dorpilya sector, they were told by the 51st Combined Arms Army that the Russians held like Gorobizhny, this one village, and the front one was actually something like 10 kilometers away. And so the first mechanized assault failed because the guys had no clue where the front line was. Yeah. And then when the 76th Air Assault Division got sent to Pokrovsk, they ripped without a unit, and they also were told the completely incorrect front line. And that basically when units rip out, they have guys who are kind of in this gray zone, and they kind of get left by that unit. Like we're going to pull back, and like, okay, too bad, so on. So there are serious like tactical effects of the lying in terms of the Russian military. And again, how it gets passed up is clearly a big problem. Some of the maps, some of the Ukrainian guys have captured maps, the Russian side, that shows just, completely, a wrong representation of the situation. But look, this is the situation and the system Putin has built, right? And I think part of the problem is he's a former intelligence officer. I think when he gets briefings from his FSB officers, whomever, he probably thinks he knows better than they do about the situation. And he's been in charge for too long. And I think anytime someone's in charge for, 27 years, you're living in a bubble and you don't know what real people think. And I think very clear over time, his briefers always learned we need to pass up, positive information that confirms his biases, not the opposite, because, we'll get fired if we do. And look, it's been issued the entire war. When the initial invasion plan was built on very faulty intelligence. Again, I think that was because Putin had this view that Ukraine was just weak and that that basically no one would fight. And I think his intel guys just gave him the same briefing to kind of support his own views. And again, Gerasimov is still in charge. He's been providing false information to Putin for some time. That hasn't changed. Kovaliov is still there. We're almost a year since the initial comments about this. So this is a system that he's comfortable with, that he created. And that's one of the reasons I also think there are prospects for Ukraine to go back on offense, where if 2 units are not talking to each other, and so in the Kupiansk operation, for example, when Ukraine's pushed back, there are 2 Russian regiments. One was in the city, one was north of the city. The 2 regiments were not talking to each other. So when the regiment north of the city started getting pushed back, the one in the city had no clue about it. And so then they weren't ready for what happened because they didn't think the Ukrainians were that close to them. And so again, because of this system, the wrong incentives, if Ukraine goes on offense, will that battalion, regiment, brigade commander pass the hire, hey, we're losing positions? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe he waits and is not going to do so. Will the adjacent unit know what's happening? Maybe, maybe not. So maybe they don't bring over reinforcements fast enough to respond to it. And I think this entire system, the dishonesty creates vulnerabilities that give Ukraine opportunities even with their manpower issues.
Unfortunately, unlike Putin, our time is running out. So lastly, I wanted 2 questions, sort of provocation. So now imagine that Putin listens, actually. He opens his eyes. And there is Rob Lee, Chief of Russian General Staff. General Rob Lee. By the way, you're not related to Robert E. Lee.
I'm not, no.
Okay. So General Rob Lee, Chief of Russian General Staff, and the question is, what would he do today in this situation? What would you do as a Russian general commanding Russian forces?
I think Russia's best, decision is to end the war, is to try and, cut their losses and try to freeze the front line where it is. Ukraine is, Zelensky's come out and kind of made this kind of opportunity. And I think Russia needs to fix a variety of things. They have a variety of problems to address internally in terms of their economy, a bunch of other issues. If they don't do this, there is a real risk that Ukraine goes back on offense and Ukraine starts taking back territory. And if they can't continue to resupply, Crimea and so on, they'll have a variety of issues there. So I think they pretty clearly met diminishing returns in this war maybe last year. We're at a point right now where Ukraine is posing really significant challenges to them, and I think they really need to consider ending the war. And if they don't end the war in the near future, things could deteriorate even further, and other possibilities become kind of possible that we might not have thought of maybe a year or 2 ago.
Well, that kind of answer, I'm pretty sure as a Russian general, you should be careful of windows. The second question is, imagine that you are in the shoes of General Syrsky. What would you do now? differently? I mean, obviously, because there's a lot of criticism towards General Sirsky, but nonetheless, he's not being replaced as well. So what would you do differently if you could?
Differently, I'm not sure. I'm gonna jump in there. You know, what I would say is, you know, General Sirsky is an offensively minded general, right? We know this.
Yeah.
He was in charge of the Kursk offensive, the Kharkiv offensive, so on. I think, and that's one reason why I think Ukraine is going, if they have the potential, they're going to try and do an offensive. Maybe it's small, so on. But I think he's always looking for these kind of vulnerabilities. I suspect he's going to look for this. I suspect, you know, he's looking at this middle strike campaign, this interdiction campaign, and if he finds a weak point in the lines, I wouldn't be surprised he goes for it. And I think we are seeing right now Ukrainian forces pushing back north of Liman. There's a salient up there. You know, I think Ukraine might be able to take this back. We'll have to wait and see, but there's a delay on the mappers kind of updating the map for operational security reasons, but you know, I think they're having some successes. There's some successes in the Zeleny Hall direction as well. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we see, you know, more kind of offensive operations. You know, the big issues for Ukraine has had it for some time is the manpower. Yeah. That's a strategic issue. And part of this is that there are issues that have not been resolved for some time, right? So the guys who volunteered in 2022, there was no demobilization plan for them. There was no rotation plan, and human resources just have not been managed as well as they should have been. And so guys who've been serving 4 years, they're tired. A lot of them are just not, they're not at the optimal level anymore because they've been fighting for so long, and they haven't been rotated. And that really, again, you know, the new Minister of Defense, Federal, is coming up with proposals. He's doing reforms. It is a question, will these, you know, work at this point? I think the idea is good that he's trying to, you know, give fixed contracts for infantrymen, right? Because right now, if you get mobilized and you get sent to an infantry unit, you know that you might be at the front line for 6 months, no rotation, right? And then there's no necessary demobilization, and there's no necessary rotation on infantry. And so, you know, then it becomes the prospect of maybe you 6 months at the front line, you come back and you say, I'm just not doing it again. Like, you're not forcing me to go back again. I will go AWOL instead of go back. The idea of setting up, okay, you're only going to serve for 1 year in the infantry and you know, something else, I think this is a much better idea that gives kind of, you know, new soldiers a better understanding of how they'll be treated. But because of the manpower problems, demobilization has just been too much of an issue because you can't afford to lose guys because the military is having enough issues sustaining them. So this is really the big challenge. You know, it is something that General Sirsky's mentioned, as well as the Minister of Defense Fedorov, as well as, Budanov has mentioned this as well when he took over his position in the presidential office. So this is really the big issue for them to deal with. But you know, look, even there are issues in Ukrainian military still, right? There are still reforms that need to be done. Despite those issues, right, the situation is still developing in a better direction, right? And so again, the Russians are facing more challenges now. Ukraine is able to exploit these things. And so, you know, again, the dynamic is better, even though there are still reforms that certainly need to be implemented.
On this good note, I thank you, Rob, for this opportunity. I hope to see you sometime again.
Absolutely.
Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Ačiū žiūrėjusiems ir iki, ačiū už rėmimą.
Laidą remia įkrautas elektromobilių įkrovimo sprendimai, saulės elektrinės ir energijos kaupikliai jūsų namams ar verslui.